Okay, so as I said, the presentation is called Power and Interdependence. It's largely based on a series of cartoons from my favorite cartoonist called Chapat, based in Geneva. But hopefully there's a bit of content to it. So, as you know, everything starts on in June 23rd, 2016, when by a reasonable majority, the British decide to vote for Brexit. It has to be reminded, because we have tended to forget it, that the government led by David Cameron at the time didn't ask the people to vote for Brexit. It actually asked them to vote against it, to remain in the UK. The British Conservative government campaigned for Remain, but the no side won. And here we see what was the mood at the moment, at the time, very much, I think, in Europe, which was the feeling that the British were leaving the European Union, and they blamed everything on the European Union for what went wrong in the UK. And there was this strange feeling, because at the same time, quickly we saw that most of the bad consequences of that Brexit vote didn't happen on the continent, but in the UK itself. I mean, there was really a change of tone in the weeks that followed the referendum. At the beginning, there was a lot of speculation that Brexit would lead to Frexit, Dexit, and other kinds of disintegration dynamics in the European Union. But in fact, it's the UK itself that became deeply divided. So there was a negotiation that started. I'm not going to go through all the details of that negotiation. The main negotiator on the EU side was Michel Barnier, now a putative presidential candidate in the French elections. And on the UK side, there were different negotiators, but here you have David Davis. And the negotiation turned out to be a lot more complicated than people expected. The referendum had asked a simple question. The UK is not like a province of Europe. It had its sovereignty, but despite being a sovereign nation, having had 50 years of interdependence with the common market in particular, turned out to be extremely difficult to disentangle. One reason for it was that the British government wasn't quite clear on what it wanted, but I would argue that a more important reason was simply that it was extremely difficult to find the trade-offs between basically what the UK wanted as much as it could, which was to stay in the financial market as much as possible, perhaps in the goods market, certainly in the services market, but didn't want to keep what's the freedom of circulation for people, because that had been the main stake during the referendum. And the EU kind of wanted the opposite, was pushing for as much freedom of circulation for people as it could, didn't have strong views on goods, although that turned out to be difficult too, but certainly didn't want financial integration. So the UK called for famous Article 50 in 2017. And what we saw as observers was a series of very, very complicated scenarios. And there was basically a lot of problems in the negotiation, but a lot of these problems were actually due to the fact that in London, Westminster, the parliament, could not agree on what it wanted. Basically, every option that was put on the table turned out to be rejected. And as you probably remember, that led to a lot of infighting in Westminster. It was never clear how long the government of Theresa May, which had replaced David Cameron, could hang on to power. And in the end, she lost it. Boris Johnson won first took power and then won a general election, replaced Theresa May. And basically his mandate was getting Brexit done, as he called it. And he did. And in January 2020, there was a withdrawal agreement that was signed, which was not incredibly different from what Theresa May had negotiated, but as we will see later, there were a few wrinkles that turned out to be problematic, but basically signed a withdrawal agreement, which included, and I'm going to return to it, the Northern Ireland Protocol. And then a few months later, in December 2020, not so long ago, the UK signed a new agreement with the EU called the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which basically is a free trade agreement plus. It's about the free circulation of goods, but it's not about the free circulation of capital or people or even services. So in a way, from its starting point in 2016, what is, what did the UK get from its initial hopes? Not much. It basically got a free trade agreement. The EU got most of what it wanted. And yet the situation perhaps is not as bad as people predicted back in 2016 for either side. The UK has not collapsed. It is still a pretty strong economy. The Boris Johnson government, despite all the funny stories, is firmly in power, and the EU is still together and probably in better shape now than it was in 2016. So now, where are we at? London is currently negotiating free trade agreements with as many countries as it can, including my own country, Canada. But of course, the biggest prize would be the United States, and that's very far from being done. We can return to it if you want. And there's a really big domestic challenge with international consequences, and that's Northern Ireland, which is going to be a problem for months and perhaps years to come. So before we return to all these issues, let's talk about international relations. What I'm going to do, it's very simple. I'm going to submit to you the main explanations that I think can be found or drawn from international relations. And I think, again, that what these different explanations show is that it's impossible to understand a phenomenon like Brexit and its consequences if you don't mix together domestic factors and international factors. So the first explanation that was very, very prevalent back in 2016 was the argument that Brexit was a victory of populism. 2016 is when Donald Trump was about to take power. There was a lot of books coming out about populism, a lot of discussion about populism, and the whole Leave movement was interpreted as a populist movement. What do we mean by that? Basically, a movement that said there is one people and we blame another group, foreigners, the EU, as the problem, and the elites as the traitors that basically favored the other, the EU, or the immigrants, rather than the people. Here you see Nigel Farage, the leader of the Leave movement, who basically won an incredible gamble in 2016 in winning the referendum, despite the fact that he was leading a very small party. So the argument that he made at the time, "We want our country back," became a kind of motto for populists all around the world. That is a very powerful interpretation, which shows how populism basically based a lot of its political success on blaming international cooperation, on blaming immigration in particular. But we have to keep in mind that the 2016 referendum was also a contingent event. David Cameron made the decision to hold a referendum basically because he had a very small problem inside his Conservative Party. He had a group of backbenchers who didn't like Europe very much, that had been complaining for the past 30 years about EU membership and felt the pressure of the UKIP movement that was, enjoying some success in the elections, although it was very far from ever winning an election in the UK. And facing that, David Cameron, having won the referendum in Scotland, felt that he could basically crush these backbenchers, crush the opposition by winning a referendum. So there's a contingent dimension to it. Some people would say that the referendum would have happened anyway one day, and that may be the case. But it didn't have to happen in 2016, and even the way that the campaign was led suggests that it could have been a win, it could have been a loss. Basically, it was, as I said, a comfortable but still not huge majority that voted in favor of Remain. So we have to keep in mind that in these events, there's a lot of contingency as well. Populism didn't have necessarily to win the vote. So that's one sort of group of explanations that basically suggests to what extent, or asks to what extent, was that a success of populism or not. Another group of explanation is and here you see Boris Johnson on his famous zip line carrying the UK flag, a bit as if he were a kind of clownesque James Bond in the sky of London. There's been a lot of writing about Brexit as being a return to a kind of colonial past, or as at least some kind of return to the Anglosphere that Winston Churchill was so fond of. And indeed, there's been this argument that Brexit was about creating a global Britain. So what did global Britain mean? Did it mean innovative, economic, powerful? Did it mean having close relations with former colonies, or including the United States? I mean, clearly that was an important part of what went on in the public discourse at the time, and even today is very much crucial when you try to understand how the UK is thinking, or not the UK, how some people in the UK are thinking about Brexit. So there was this idea that the UK, is leaving the small Europe to return to the globe, to the world where its real position lies. At the same time, what we saw with Brexit was the return of nationalism, not only UK nationalism, but also English nationalism, facing other kinds of nationalisms in the UK, in Scotland, in Ireland, perhaps less so in Wales. But the idea is that, in fact, Brexit may lead not to a global Britain, but to a shrunk Britain. And indeed, if you look at the vote on Brexit, it is not only a populist vote, it is a nationalist vote. And against nationalism, as we saw in general in the past, there's a lot of nationalisms or counter-nationalisms in reaction. So that's another explanation that I think is crucial if you try to understand Brexit, this idea that it's not only about a political movement against the international, it's also about different conceptions of what the nation is in the 21st century, the sort of post-colonial hangover that is very important in countries like the UK or France and a few others. And the fact that in general, if you have a nationalist movement, that tends to create counter-nationalism. And this is what may or may not happen in Scotland, but is certainly happening right now in Northern Ireland. A third explanation that I want to put to you is the idea that, in fact, Brexit is an illustration or a symptom of the decline of Europe in general. So if you look at what's happened from, say, Beijing's point of view, what's happening is that Europe is incredibly divided. It tried to stick together with the EU, but the UK leaving the EU is a problem for the EU as well. Even though the EU fared better than what one could have feared, it has lost a very important member in terms of demographics, in terms of military power and economic power as well. And so the idea here is that, well, Donald Trump is no longer in office, but Vladimir Putin still is, and so is Xi Jinping in China, and that they see kind of Brexit as a weakening of Europe, of the UK, but also of the continent. And the idea here is that divide and conquer makes Europe incredibly irrelevant in the world. And so that's very important for international relations. So that's one, again, argument. But against this argument, what one could argue that, in fact, The UK, I mean, the jury is still out on how it's going to get out of this. But as far as the EU goes, it's, as I said, probably a bit better, in a better shape now than it was 5 or 10 years ago. And there's the very strong feeling on the continent that despite initial fears, the EU works better without the UK than it did with it. I'm not going to go through all the changes since the pandemic, but to take one example, Next Generation EU, this big stimulus plan that was agreed with the 27 member states, would likely have never been agreed had the UK still been on board. As I said, at first there was this idea that the EU would basically dissolve. It didn't, and in a lot of ways it strengthened it. The fact that the UK left strengthened the EU, including in public opinion, where we see that there's more support for the EU now in all EU countries than there was before Brexit. The fact that it was so complicated probably dissuaded several people, but also political leaders that tended to be Eurosceptic, that they should get out of it. So that doesn't mean that Europe is now, the center of the world. Certainly not. It faces a lot of challenges, but perhaps it is not a lot weaker without the UK than it would have been, or than people probably thought. So I've almost exhausted my time, and by way of conclusion, what I'd like to do is just present you with another argument, which I think is not in contradiction to the ones that I've seen, that I've shown you, but is probably more useful to understand where Brexit is going to have consequences on Europe in general and the world as well. And that's the argument that I draw from the if you want the old liberal school in international relations, power and interdependence. That what we see with Brexit is the fact that economies, societies, polities have become very interdependent across the globe, but especially so on the European continent. Being interdependent doesn't mean that power is no longer an issue. It's not just a positive-sum game. It's a game that people played where states, governments, leaders, societies, firms are kind of stuck with each other. It's difficult to disentangle their relationships, but they still use these interdependencies to sort of get as much as they can, and that creates a lot of the issues that we see in international relations, especially since beneath these interdependencies, there are strong domestic constraints or factors. So I'm going to give you 3 examples, I think. The first, you've probably read in the papers recently around the island of Jersey on the Channel. There was a kind of naval war a few months ago between French fishermen who basically said that the UK did not respect the quotas that were agreed in the new trade and cooperation agreement. So they staged a pretty violent naval demonstration against it. And in retaliation, Boris Johnson actually sent a patrol vessel, so a Royal Navy vessel. So it became almost military. There was de-escalation, but fisheries is a good example where you see that, in fact, well, the fish don't care so much whether they're in the UK or on the European continent, but the reality is that most of what is fished or caught in the sea goes, a lot of what the British catch is actually exported to the continent, and a lot of what the French catch is actually exported to the UK. And so that's a clear case of interdependence, but people weaponize that interdependence to get what they want or what they think they deserve. And so you have a problem that is clear in the case of fisheries. It's very symbolic because of the Royal Navy, but you'll probably see that in most of the sectors that are affected by Brexit, where the interdependence has not disappeared, but it creates a lot of conflicts. We can, talk about the details if you're interested during the Q&A. Another example of that is Northern Ireland. So as part of the withdrawal treaty, there was an agreement not to create, as you probably know, a border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. The reason being that there was fear that it would create conflicts between Catholics and Protestants, because thanks to integration, it's become kind of easy to live on the island since the 70s, and especially since the Good Friday Agreement signed in 1998. So Boris Johnson, the main difference between his version of the withdrawal agreement and Theresa May's version was that he said Northern Ireland will remain in the single market, if you want, and we'll agree to have a kind of the customs check between the island of Ireland and England. He has kind of reneged on it slowly and mostly for political reasons, because there's a strong Protestant unionist movement in Northern Ireland that doesn't like being separated from England. And that creates a lot of tensions on the island itself, but also between London, Dublin, and the European Union, where Brussels sides with Dublin against, of course, London. So again, we have a very interdependent island. There's a lot of economic and human traffic between the northern and the southern sides of the island. And the idea that you will create a border somewhere, either on the island or between the island and the rest of the UK, creates a lot of tensions that actors use to their own benefits. And that's not going to go away either. We can hope that it won't flare into outright conflict, but that's going to stay with Brexit. That's I'm not going to talk about this, but we can talk about it if you want to understand the details of the Northern Ireland Protocol. And maybe, well, maybe I'll end with a somewhat nicer interpretation or vision of power in interdependence by giving you two examples. One is finance. As I mentioned, the UK's main objective in the negotiation was to make sure that it would protect the City of London, which is 7% of its GDP. And London had become the base for most financial transactions in Europe, despite the fact that it was not in the Eurozone. It was covered by EU rules, and therefore there was a very easy access to the City of London for example, European firms. So they lost that, meaning that EU rules no longer apply to London, but London-based firms no longer have, for example, banks no longer have access to or automatic access to the European continent. And the question was, will the city come out of this stronger, or will it lose a lot of its operations to European capitals like Paris or Frankfurt, or financial capitals like Frankfurt? And the reality so far is mixed. It's not quite clear what's going to happen, but what's interesting is that the power games that are being played are not only between London and Europe as a whole, but also inside Europe. So here you had a big fight between Paris, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and other cities that basically all wanted their share of, or their chunk of, what they could get from London. The City of London has not collapsed at all. The evidence suggests that it's lost some trade to the European continent. We'll see how much. But it's interesting to see how the interdependence that's been created also affects the European continent. And the very last point I want to raise is the following one. That's a picture of Boris Johnson and Emmanuel Macron at the G7 summit in the UK. And despite all the problems that have been created by Brexit, both for the UK, for Europe and for international relations more generally. The truth is that the UK is still very much a European country. So if you look at the biggest global challenges, climate change, taxation, international security, the reality is that the UK is still very close to the European Union. There's very little disagreement on these major issues. So the interdependence that's been created over the past several decades lingers on. It still has a lot of influence on the way that leaders, political parties, but also more generally the public sees its interests and its values in the world. And so the fact that the UK left the EU didn't turn out to be as catastrophic or as great as some people like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping may have hoped or feared. It turned out to have it had a lot of impact on the UK-EU relationship, certainly on British politics, not so much on international relations so far. So that's also a lesson to draw from these moments like Brexit. One should not necessarily conclude that the worst is always going to occur. So I'm going to stop here because I think I've spoken 5 minutes more than the time I was allotted, but hopefully we can have time for Q&A and discussion, and I look forward to hearing your own views on all of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frédéric, and it's been very complete, and you've covered a lot of ground. I think it's also relates to some of the work we're doing with NEXTEUK. We're wondering if we are actually, we're going to witness the de-Europeanization, as everybody was announcing when it comes to the impact on UK domestic policies, polity and politics, but actually convergence could be one of the way forward, as you just outlined, because of interdependence. So I'm sure you have raised a lot of reaction and questions. So anyone wants to get started, you can just raise your hand. Any remarks, any questions?
I will mainly, okay. Robert,
sorry.
No, Robert, that one, he was there first too.
So Robert and Agathe? Robert, do you still want to intervene?
Yeah. Can you hear me, Dr. Wolf?
We cannot hear you very well, at least not on my side. Maybe you can type in your question if there is some issue in the chat. No, we cannot hear you very well. What I suggest is... Sorry, Agathe, could you go first? And then Robert, please type in your question in the chat.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Frédéric, for this very interesting presentation. I think that you mentioned a lot of very different things, but domestic factors, international factors, populism, but also this idea of colonial past, and also something very important about the state of the union. So a lot of very different things. I just wanted to ask you a few words about what has been the impact of the US elections for you on the EU-UK relations, because you mentioned that Brexit happened at the same time that Trump arrived to the power. So maybe there's something here. We also know that there's a lot of links between the Irish community and the US, especially with Joe Biden. So can you maybe say a few words about the impact of these 2020 US elections on these relations? Is it going to weaken the UK? Yes, so I will stop here.
Thank you, Agathe.
Yeah, go.
Thank you, Agathe. I mean, I think I would raise 3 points. The first is in Northern Ireland itself. So it's not only that Joe Biden has is a Catholic. It's also that the US, like Canada, were involved in the Good Friday Agreement. And so they feel that they are responsible for the Good Friday Agreement. And Northern Ireland is extremely interesting. In 2016, no one thought about that problem. Certainly not in the UK, but even in Brussels, frankly, it came as a surprise at the beginning that that the EU insisted on it, and it probably even came as a bigger surprise that Theresa May, at the time, she agreed on the notion that there would be no border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which has created, from the point of view of Brexit, most of the problems, but it's totally justified if you think about peace and order on the island of Ireland. And so for Joe Biden, it may have been different under Donald Trump, but it would not have been different in Canada. They feel that this is the main peace and security challenge of Brexit, and therefore they take a real interest in it. I'm old enough to remember how significant the Good Friday Agreement was in 1998. People have forgotten about it, and that's a good thing because it actually led to to pacification of the relationship. But now the challenges are I would say bigger than they have been for at least 2 decades now. So that's one element. The other element is just that partly, of course, not only Boris Johnson, but the whole Leave movement was premised on the idea that they would have a strong ally in Washington, especially with Donald Trump there. So there seemed for several years to be this kind of a complicity between Washington and London. That's now gone, especially since Boris Johnson was a bit too explicit in his love for Donald Trump. So that doesn't, of course, convince Joe Biden that he should give him more than he needs. And in general, of course, the Democrats in the US, like again a country like Canada, were never in favor of Brexit. They have this positive prejudice in favor of international cooperation in general, and therefore they don't see Brexit in the same Anglo-spheric eyes as did maybe Donald Trump, who had yeah. But the third element I want to raise just really quickly, and here you're probably better experts than I am, but it seems to me that the domestic British situation has changed as well, where despite all the crazy things that I read in the papers, Boris Johnson seems much less under threat from the Nigel Farage crowd than Theresa May was, for example. And he has a stable government, so that makes it easier for an opportunistic leader like he is to go with the flow. He doesn't need to sort of overplay the US-UK relationship as much as probably he felt 2 years ago, I would say.
Thank you. And I see we have another question in the chat. So Robert, who couldn't ask his question, has asked, what do you think, whether you think it's a permanent leave? That's, yeah, if you have a crystal ball, it's always a good question, but especially I think because he's raising the view that many younger people, and I remember when I was teaching, couldn't even vote, yeah, at the time of the referendum, and were not really, did not agree. So that, and I think, yes, so that was his first question. I see Chloe, do you want to ask your question? We take several questions and then Frédéric can answer. Let's say 2 or 3. Chloe.
Okay. So I've mainly looked at Brexit through, you know, a legal perspective and EU exit legislation, and particularly in relation to the environment. And there is a lot of sort of divergence and fragmentation going on there. So it's sort of the political perspective has been more one of personal experience, having lived in the country while it's happening. And I definitely, sort of understand that as being something that had a lot to do with domestic politics and the Conservative Party politics, and this agenda for sort of taking back control. And definitely you see that in the legal side of things. And then when you think about that in terms of the international perspective, so for environment, it's sort of seen as less binding. So I wonder if you could say more about this international arena and how, well, like I say, in environment, it's often seen as less binding. So in that respect, it would be domestic policies and politics, which would be more binding. And then we might see more divergence with the European Union or internationally.
Thank you very much. I just take one last question in the chat, Frédéric, which is from Deborah, and more of a domestic political one, to understand if Brexit cut across traditional political lines, and how much it affects then the Tory Remainers, Labour Leavers, Lib Dem, deniers. So yeah, to what extent is it, I think, reshaping the political landscape as well in the UK? Yes, and we had one last question from Angelica, also on Scotland and demands for independence. And how do you think Brexit has sharpened internal divisions, of course, with demands for independence? So just respond what you can in the remaining time. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you remind me, Sarah, how much time I have?
Well, we have a break after you. So I think if everybody agrees, we take a good 5 minutes for you to answer. Yes?
Perfect. Yeah, perfect. So Deborah's question is actually my answer to Robert's question. The fact that it has so profoundly shaped or destroyed or reshaped party politics in the UK is one explanation why I think it is settled for at least 1 or 2 generations. I mean, one can never say no, or it's impossible to say that nothing's going to change. But I think it's unlikely that a political party would run, at least for a generation, on the promise of reuniting the European Union, because there would not be internal consensus on this issue. So now that doesn't mean that there won't be a whole lot of side agreements or bilateral treaties signed between the UK and the EU to deal with all the externalities or all the problems raised by Brexit. That's what we saw in the case of Switzerland. Switzerland signed all these bilateral treaties with the EU when it decided not to join the EU. Now it's become a completely chaotic situation with Switzerland. I'm not going to go into this, but that's not an unlikely scenario where, in fact, there would be more interdependence, or there would be as much interdependence between the EU and the UK in 10 or 15 years. But I doubt very much that someone would organize a referendum on a reunification, so to speak, for a while. About the environment, Chloe, I mean, your question is very interesting because it's at the heart of the potential misunderstanding between the EU and the UK, and that's the whole idea of convergence versus divergence. The EU is very worried that the UK will use the opportunity to turn into a Singapore upon Thames that is trying to become an ultra liberal country that would benefit from its access to the European market without following the rules. And that's why the trade and cooperation agreement is full of mechanisms to make sure that if ever the UK goes too far, then the EU could put an end to it. There would be a break. And that's certainly true when it comes to the environment. And you're right that domestic politics matters more than international agreements. At the same time, the environment is a very good example of an issue where the UK's position is indistinguishable from the EU's on the international stage, and will probably remain so for the foreseeable future, because the domestic politics are the same. I mean, that's the thing that always strikes me. The British are a lot more European than they think they are, and you can see it on issues like the environment and safety requirements. I mean, the reason why I think it's very unlikely that there will be a real trade deal between the US and the UK is because the British population thinks like the European population, and they don't like this the chlorine chicken that we in North America enjoy so much, and the pesticides and whatnot, and that would make the signature of a trade agreement extremely difficult with the US because of the agricultural market. And on Scottish independence, that's a very, again, I mean, we can't make any predictions, but it is quite clear that Brexit has given a boost to Scottish nationalism. It is not clear that it will lead to Scottish independence, because if you think about all the problems of interdependence that I've only skimmed over between the UK and the EU, can you imagine between Scotland and the rest of England? I mean, the interconnections are even older, they're even deeper, and Scottish independence would be, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I come from Quebec, so I'm very sensitive to these issues, but it would be extremely complicated. So that's probably going to play a role in a possible future referendum on the issue, which may turn out, for example, to be closer. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen, but it's not automatic that Scotland will rejoin the EU. It is, in a way, some people say, more likely than that Northern Ireland would get a lot closer to the Republic of Ireland if a solution is not found in the next few years, especially since the demographics are also in favor of it.
Okay. So I'm looking at the chat and I see we have more questions, but I also know we need a break before continuing the rest of the program. So Frédéric, is that okay if the students want to email you with one or two more questions? But I think it's been really, very complete and really good recap, but also I think on this item of interdependence, the fact that the British are not so far away from Europeans on many issues is very interesting. I would have liked to ask you what was the situation in Canada and how they see it, but I think we can have another conversation on that. So thank you so much. It's been really, really a great start of this PhD summer school. Thank you also for the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence at the University of Montreal for partnering with us on that summer school. And I think we have a 10-minute break until we start again in the other Zoom session. For the moment, we leave you to a nice day in Canada.
Have a nice week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.